During World War II, the actions taken by the federal government against Japanese Americans and the Japanese living in the nation were cruel, anti-democratic, and unjustified, and subjected thousands of individuals to economic, political, and racial injustices. On February 19, 1942, approximately 10 weeks after the December 7, 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order granted the Secretary of War the power to, quote, exclude all persons, both citizens and aliens, from designated areas in order to provide security against sabotage or espionage, end quote. Although the text of Executive Order 9066 did not specifically mention Japanese Americans, the West Coast, evacuation, or internment, it was understood that the purpose of the order was to give the Army the power to remove Japanese Americans from the Pacific Coast, regardless of their citizenship. Roosevelt's order was dangerous in its infringement of the constitutional protections inherent in American citizenship. Its vague language concealed an unprecedented assertion of executive power, allowing the president to impose military rule on civilians without a declaration of martial law, and allowing the president to force incarceration under the supervision of armed guards, despite the fact that the writ of habeas corpus had not been suspended by Congress. We can talk more about these abridgments of civil liberties later. The president cited military necessity as the basis for the incarceration and perceived Japan as a potential military and economic rival of the United States. FDR was overprepared to believe the worst about the entire Japanese American community, despite lack of any firm evidence concerning Japanese American disloyalty. Roosevelt did not react in this way toward any other aliens. His actions suggest that his concern for security was underlined by a belief that Japanese Americans were dangerous and foreign. If military necessity had been the sole criterion for action, Roosevelt would have approved military proposals for control of other enemy aliens, such as the Italians, who posed a potential threat to security. Perhaps this is because the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor provoked nationwide anger that far surpassed American bitterness against Germany or Italy. Roosevelt's past feelings towards the Japanese significantly shaped his decision to evacuate American citizens from their homes. FDR had a history of viewing Japanese Americans in racialized terms and supported immigration restriction and legal discrimination to discourage Japanese American settlement. Roosevelt's words and actions both before and after Pearl Harbor suggested that he believed that Japanese American citizens were still Japanese at the core and incapable of being true Americans. He did not consider them racially inferior, but, rather, a biologically distinct people. Consequently, he treated evacuation with a lack of interest, displaying little hesitation over the signing of Executive Order 9066. Roosevelt was unwilling to devote sufficient attention to the bias underlying the case for evacuation. His inability to regard people of Japanese ancestry as true Americans led to his failure to intervene to protect their liberty and property rights following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Although he realized that the Nisei, or people of Japanese descent born and raised in the United States, were United States citizens, he was unwilling to recognize that they had the same inalienable rights to due process and equal protection of the laws as other citizens. Roosevelt's view of Japanese Americans as a discrete, unified group that would identify with their mother country shaped his policy toward them. To the president, winning the war took precedence over the legal and moral questions involved in evacuation. Roosevelt justified discrimination on the grounds that the Japanese were people of Oriental blood. His focus on preserving racial purity reveals that he shared the racism widespread among white Americans of his background and period. Evacuation represented the culmination of a historic pattern of prejudice and legal discrimination against the Japanese on the West Coast. Roosevelt simply ignored the legal problems created by a policy of incarceration of citizens. Instead of declaring martial law or endorsing congressional efforts to legalize mass confinement of citizens without charge, a power not granted by the Constitution, he defined incarceration as resettlement. Executive Order 9066 was enforced at a time in the United States when the military activities of Japan were generating alarm, and when Japan's increasing economic and diplomatic self-assertion led to tension with the established powers. On the very day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also struck the Philippines, Wake and Midway Islands, and Hong Kong. Amidst an atmosphere rife with fear and paranoia, Americans began to regard Japanese on the mainland and in Hawaii as a serious threat and potential danger. Stories of sabotage and attacks circulated extensively. Despite the rampant and unfounded accusations against Japanese Americans, fears for American security were biased. 40 years after World War II, when the United States government closely reviewed the circumstances and details surrounding Japanese internment, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, or CWRIC, declared that there had not been a basis for the detention and stated that a terrible injustice had been bestowed upon resident aliens of Japanese ancestry and American citizens. Even intelligence reports gathered at the time of the internment stated that mass confinement was not a military necessity and that there was no evidence of Japanese American sabotage. Rather, suspicions against Japanese Americans were often rooted in racial prejudice, apparent both in the public and in the military. The underlying purpose of the internment was to single out an unpopular group of American citizens on a racial basis and to dispossess and incarcerate them without charge. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, who was in charge of West Coast security under Secretary of War Henry Stimson, increased anti-Japanese fervor. DeWitt unjustifiably claimed that there were indications that ethnic Japanese were organizing and preparing for action within the United States. He considered the exclusion of the Japanese from the West Coast a military necessity because he believed that one's loyalty was solely determined by ethnic heritage. To justify the ruthless evacuation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, the federal government claimed that the exclusion protected ethnic Japanese from vigilantes. However, the CWRIC failed to find evidence that supported this claim. Between December of 1941 and February of 1942, approximately 25 serious crimes against the Japanese were reported. Providing protection from hostility was not a sufficient reason for mass evacuation, because maintaining peace was a civil rather than a military matter. Furthermore, protection would not require ordering Japanese Americans from their homes and interning them for such an extended period of time. The apparent racism underlying internment was the product of decades of anti-Asian prejudice prior to World War II. Generations of settlers from Europe had transplanted a traditional European Orientalist view of Asia as an exotic, backward, and barbaric land. Furthermore, the migration of Chinese laborers to the western United States during the mid-1800s stimulated a backlash of resentment by white farmers. Initially, however, during the mid-1800s, the Japanese were welcomed in Hawaii as a source of cheap labor in sugar plantations. By the late 1800s, labor groups in Hawaii were recruited in substantial numbers to come to the mainland to work in agriculture. Yet, levels of prejudice and hostility on the mainland increased with a growing Japanese population, and by 1920, Americans believed that Japan had embarked on a race war and was attempting to advance its imperial ambitions in the United States. By the time Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, 77% of Americans distrusted Japanese Americans on racial lines. Embracing these speculative assumptions, the media depicted the Japanese as a yellow peril, and the racist 1908 Gentlemen's Agreement between the United States and Japan severely curtailed immigration from Japan. 16 years later, in response to nativist pressure, the Immigration Act completely halted all Japanese immigration to the United States until 1965. This ban outraged the Japanese and embittered Japanese-American relations. The 1913 Alien Land Law in California barred the Japanese from purchasing land and owning property. Issei, or immigrant aliens, were forced to release their farms or to rely on white friends to hold their property for them as the legal owners. In 1920, California enacted a more stringent alien land law, which barred Japanese and other Asian immigrants from obtaining long-term leases on land. Furthermore, people of Japanese descent were ineligible to become American citizens unless they were born in the United States, because the nation's first immigration law, passed in 1790, stated that only free whites could be naturalized. Ultimately, the federal government denied naturalization and suffrage rights to Japanese American aliens because of their racial difference. This provoked anger and a desire for revenge among the Japanese, which in turn provided a pretext that the Japanese government could rely on international support for its war of conquest.